climate change. So please come, and with Dimitri and Christina. Can we give them a...
Thank you, everyone. First of all, thank you for being here. I was very pleased to hear that the Gen Summit wanted to discuss about climate change. So I'm Charlotte Davio, and I work at the European Climate Foundation. I think it's very interesting that we speak about tourism with this climate angle, and for that I will have two panelists. First, I will have Christina Putetsi, who is a columnist at Protagon. Then I will have Dimitri Shishkin, who is a Chief Content Officer at Culture Trip. So we will have two points of view about how their work evolved through the years, but also how the readers' tourist habit evolved lately. So tourism is a sector who is partially responsible of the climate crisis. We know that. Studies say that it's responsible between 4 and 8% of the global greenhouse gas emission. And researchers also say that this impact is undermined because tourism can't be reduced as travel. Christina actually liked to say that tourism is global and it's a global topic, but it's also a global issue. Tourism is also about local consumption, but also plastic waste. So we have to think way bigger than just travel. And we know that this share of the global greenhouse gas emission is increasing because of the rise of middle class in many countries. But tourism is also affected by the climate crisis. We know that Earth's wonders are going to disappear, such as the coral reef. And climate crisis also implies the increase of extreme weather events, hurricane, heat. For example, India is currently suffering from a heat wave and drought. Caribbean islands have not yet totally recovered from the Irma hurricane. So that's why it's very interesting to see how you, journalists, opinion leaders, are writing about it, are speaking, are talking, and how your readers are responding to your article. We first are going to have two experience sharing with our panelists, and then we will have a discussion on how the millenniums, for example, are changing the way of they see tourism. And then we will open the floor for questions. Because tourism is both a threat for the climate crisis and the climate change, but it's also, it will soon be an endangered species. So first, Christina, if you can tell us how you work and how does it evolve lately?
Thank you, Charlotte. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to participate at the Gen Summit and in this panel talking about travel and climate change. First of all, to give you a small overview, Protagon is an online news magazine that encourages us to think differently. It is owned by a group of journalists, and since its creation 7 years ago, it has been established as a source of authoritative opinion, analysis, and investigative reporting. I have been covering tourism as a sector, its impact, its strategy, since 2006 in the economy section of one of the leading Greek newspapers, and joined Protagon 2 years ago. And my main goal throughout all these years was to highlight the layers behind the surface, analyze, and bring out the strategy in every feature. So tourism has provided me with a broad spectrum of subjects since it is a very important sector for the Greek economy. You mentioned 10.4% in the global GDP. In Greece, this applies to 30% in the country's GDP, direct and indirectly. So you can imagine how important sector it is. Just to point out some highlights regarding our subject, climate change has entered the agenda of tourism in Greece also, but it is not linked directly to travel. It is perceived as a general problem. So with tourism being such an important sector for the economy, and with Greece having recession during this last decade, it has been a sector that was the money maker all these years, and the only one to support the country's GDP. So for many, it was a breakthrough for income or even a career switch. Therefore, the approach for tourism has been volume development and not exactly the protection of the environment as such. However, because of volume, we have touched upon the subject of sustainability, and I will elaborate on the subject later on.
Great, thank you, Christina. We will see with Christina how the consumers' demands evolved, but also the business side of tourism and its impact on climate change, of course. So, Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can I have a clicker? Thanks. I just spent about 5 minutes just to explain how I fit into the whole debate and how Culture Trip fits into the whole debate. So I'm Chief Content Officer for Culture Trip, which is a travel, media and entertainment startup, which I actually never heard of before when I joined. I have spent 21 years with the BBC up until January, and then I have been with Culture Trip for 5 months. My job is there as Chief Content Officer. I'm running editorial. Culture Trip is a very, very interesting thing. We are disrupting travel business by providing a really engaging content from around the world, and our unique selling point is that we actually getting content from people who live in places which we write about. So we don't tend to travel anywhere. We operate a very robust commissioning system, which is very, very much operated on data. And for those of you who remember me from my BBC days, you would remember how important data analysis and data-informed commissioning is for me. So we really kind of found each other between Culture Trip and me. We're getting about 20 million people right now, and they're all mainly millennials and more older generation Zs. And they all come to us at the so-called top of the funnel to get inspired by the travel, and then we can get them through the funnel, and then they can book with us, and that's how we monetize our business. And it's interesting, that's what, nobody really is doing those things quite like us. There are places that do entertainment, there are places that do travel, there are places that do media, but we actually do all of it, and that's what the disruptive model is. And it seems to be working. I mean, look at the numbers. We have been growing very, very fast. We are in this hyper-growth stage. And for me, it basically is a visual representation of that younger people in the world actually are finding something very useful about our business case and our positioning in the market. So one of the things which we have, one of the things which I wanted to add to this debate is about what we at Culture Trip think about the audiences and how the audience travel and why they travel, because actually without knowing why people travel in certain ways, you can't really be successful in addressing those needs. Ultimately, what we all need to remember is that we are talking to a generation that largely nobody in that generation wants to be a tourist anymore. That is a really, really important thing. Nobody wants to be a tourist, yet 42% of people still want to avoid places where everybody goes. And how do you still create content for places where people want to go largely, and then other places that people don't want to go? But the really important thing about understanding millennials and how they travel and how they will continue traveling is actually understanding that this is a mixture of slow and fast culture, and they want both. So it's about, they want to understand deeper cultural codes when they travel, but they also want to experience life the way locals experience it. And the interesting thing about that is that the modern travelers, they want to experience those famous places, but we are providing that unique and special take on those places from people who are living in those places, and they know those places better than anybody else. And that's why people want to experience art, but they don't necessarily want to experience art in an art gallery. They want to experience art looking at street graffitis, for example. Or they want a special accommodation. They don't want to stay in hotels anymore. They want to spend time in eco hotels, or instead of going to a restaurant, they want to experience food and food markets. And this is probably one of the most important insights which we got lately from our user research. Interestingly, UK and US millennials, as you see, do worry about tourism and its impact on the environment, and 37% of them would limit their travel. to reduce its impact. But interestingly, Generation Z, the next generation that comes after millennials, they actually 11% are less likely to recycle than on average. If you compare that to the older generation, the baby boomers, so-called gray generation, that generation is actually unconcerned about impact on travel, but they actually recycle more than other people in the world. And lastly, just to kind of explain how content plays into the whole thing, is that we have collaborators from around the world. Currently, we're working with about 300 people who are creating content to a very strict creative brief, which we're sending out. And then we get them through, they create content for no plans and for inspiration, for orientation, for planning, for booking. We basically fill the whole travel cycle with content from around the world, and that's how we fit into the travel area. And again, if you remember me from the work I have done at the BBC about user needs for news, thankfully we are applying a very robust model satisfying those user needs for travel. And all of these different types of content that we create, they have been numerically calculated to be effective and they're working. And lastly, 30 seconds on, we actually do lots of content which is not only functional, which is, fulfilling funnels and, generating that income, but we actually are creating special reports, and we're just about, as a sneak preview of the project which we are launching in the next couple of weeks on water keepers. We are profiling 20 people from around the world who are saving world's waterways. And we're doing lots of interesting photo galleries and interviews and everything else with them. So inspiration content for us is equally important because it is important for the audience we're addressing. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Christina. So my first question is going to be how the consumer are actually consuming tourism. And I think, Christina, you have more this historical view on how it evolved. And did you see the upcoming climate crisis issue coming in your article, but also in their demands and requests? And then we will see how the millennials are really fond of that. Yes.
Thank you for the question, Charlotte. As I said before, the strategy for tourism in Greece has been volume. And this was the goal to set Greece as a leading destination worldwide. So volume was achieved, and we had a record of 33 million international arrivals last year. And of course, an increase in air traffic, because international arrivals are mostly air traffic to Greece. So in terms of consumer change, well, since air traffic was, we saw an increase in air traffic, there hasn't been much in this way, but maybe we could say that in some countries of origin that have conscience and developed conscience about the environment, they selected airlines that are more balanced in their emissions. So in this aspect of transport, there's no obvious change. However, we see eco-travel and green travel as a market trend, so arising. And we see also the companies, hotels, and the tourism sector, the private sector in Greece, trying to adapt to this demand. So there are practices that are starting to evolve towards this direction. One of the biggest ones, and it was in 2010, from a big resort that opened in Kalamata called Costa Navarino, that also created an observatory for climate change in the Mediterranean. And this really set up a new perspective on how the hospitality sector should adapt in this major issue. But the biggest issue that we touch upon came up on the agenda because of overcrowding. And we saw overcrowding in Venice, in Barcelona, and then we started to talk about Santorini, which is what we see on the screen. And this is a typical sunset view in Santorini, and people, hundreds of people, trying to photograph, to capture the moment. So we we spoke about over-tourism. We have started to talk about over-tourism the last 2 years. And because of over-tourism, we started to talk about sustainability and the capacity of a destination to support the influx of visitors that it receives and the natural resources because of that, and also the garbage produced because of that. So it's evolving in the agenda and practice.
Thank you, Christina. Actually, that's good news. But we also know that the air traveling is increasing every year, and we know that last year it was booming. Actually, Ryanair is one of the top 10 more polluting company. And I'm asking myself, is this new upcoming generation changing their view and tourism on air traveling? We know that they are marching all over the world every Friday with this Greta Thunberg movement, but in practice, can we see some change?
Well, let's be clear on what the task is. I don't think that media should be tasked with somehow tackling aviation industry. They can, of course, they can take people to account and talk about offset schemes that companies run and everything. But I guess I come into this discussion from the point of view of satisfying the users, and the users will travel, whether we want it or not. The fact that Culture Trip works on this intersection of travel and media, we can actually tell stories which are off the beaten track, which are quirky, which are special. We're sending people to perhaps different locations. So Santorini is a good example, right? So we might say, actually, don't stay in Santorini. Actually, visit early in the morning where nobody is there. You can take your picture, the best pictures at 5 o'clock in the morning, and actually then you can leave and don't impact on that. And we currently have 80,000 pieces of content in our database, and all of them, well, not all of them, but most of them will be written from those type of specific quirky angles. So you can actually say, as I said, nobody wants to be a tourist anymore, and I don't understand why people still bother with that picture in Santorini, actually. But from the content perspective, as a chief content officer for my company, I would actually try and commission lots of pieces which satisfy those user needs to travel sustainably, for example. We do write, for every location that we would have pieces specifically about eco-friendly hotels, better ways of getting there, those types of things. And we also know that one of the most popular pieces amongst young people on our site was actually about tips of how to travel sustainably. This is about things like bringing your own cutlery with you, for example, not to use the plastic. Actually, some people talk about recycling and littering, but actually many people don't actually talk about the food littering, where a food which is discarded from restaurants and other places actually gets into an ecosystem and damages ecosystem in a much bigger way than other things that can damage ecosystem. Not a lot of people actually think about that. So, of course, carbon offsets is important to people. So my job would be to basically keep that in mind, but manage that need from people to travel against the environmental kind of sensibility.
Yes, sure. Yesterday we had this amazing presentation from the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, who explained us that they changed their vocabulary on the climate crisis. They don't say climate change anymore, they don't say global warming. And has your vocabulary evolved through the years too? Do you have new words, because it's also a new issue, or more concern and well understood?
Well, the most popular new word is over-tourism. And I think it's something that has been an issue for the last 2 years. And since then, also destination management has been another phrase that's very popular and a new necessity, because destinations have come to understand that from marketing, they have to switch to management because they cannot deal with the volumes that they receive. But we are very good in theory, but we lack in practice. And I'd like to refer to a recent release from the World Tourism Organization with regards with the World Environment Day, which was on June 5th, and it released a first report on the integration of sustainable consumption and production patterns into tourism policies, saying that countries around the world are integrating sustainability in their tourism policies, but the evidence on the results of their implementation remains limited. This means that policymakers are aware of the importance of sustainable consumption and production, but the references to policy instruments aiming at relevant implementation are limited, and so is the evidence available for other aspects beyond the economic performance of the sector. I would like to bring an example. I was recently, I just came back actually, I was in a marketplace, tourism marketplace in the US, in California, and the issue of sustainability arose, especially in California and after the wildfires of last year. We were on a press trip afterwards along the coastline of California in small towns, beach towns, and the example was to show us the low-key way of traveling. And they set up a bonfire on the beach just to show us the customs. It was a very nice example, but afterwards, after the food, I saw that food and plastic plates were all thrown in the same bag. And it was a huge amount. There are 3 big bags of that. So this is sustainability in theory, but not in practice. And then leaving from San Francisco, we were in San Francisco with exceptional heat, 37 Celsius, taken by surprise everyone because there's no air conditioning in houses there. And everybody was talking about climate change because it hit their door, it knocked on their door, because we perceive what is familiar to us, but not something else. So.
Yeah, I guess some company have to do more effort on sustainability, that's for sure. About the threats that climate change represent, how do you speak about that? How do you speak about, for example, the coral reef disappearation, or how? Is it something you say?
It's not something that Culture Trip covers in Nemet, of course, because again we are operating on a kind of travel business / media / entertainment area. So it's not our job to cover things on the day. We absolutely cover, as I said, certain things about how to travel sustainably and our focus is on city travel as well. So I would say one thing here is that we see ourselves as the reason why we're seeing ourselves as a disruptor in that market, because we want not only to impact on the way we empower people to actually express themselves creatively about places that they love because they live there. So we sustain that cultural, I guess, ecosystem in each place where we go to, well, not where we go, which we decide to cover. So animators, illustrators, people who actually live there, they get to earn money while not being journalists. And another thing is that when we listen to the audience who wants to travel and who will travel, we actually pay attention to what they want to do while they're traveling. And we know that, a lot of people are interested in actually bringing a new skill from travel. They want to learn something. So our job is actually to highlight this to industry, then actually by bringing interesting experiences, then the tourism boards in each country can go away and start developing it. Because actually, if there is a demand for it, right, and we know that young people are interested in that, this is what people should be actually pushing through within their own countries, because it's, again, off the beaten track, quirky, but exactly what young people would expect from travel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have great hope in this upcoming generation. We are going to open the floor for questions if you have any. Please raise your hand and we have microphone in the room. Yes, a man over there.
Hello, my name is Philippe Hertzberg. I'm an independent consultant. Travel, journalism, and climate change is very dear to my heart, so this is the perfect panel. So thank you for Dimitri, Christina, Charlotte for this panel. The Guardian, as you mentioned, was really inspiring because that really pointed on the responsibility that media have to shape the discourse and sort of change the lexicon and the way they talk about the issue. So that's one relationship with readers. There's the other relationship with advertisers, where we're actually seeing media publishers refusing tour operators sort of the quantity tourism advertising budgets. And that's a very hard decision to make, but that is also a very bold statement that some media organizations are starting to make. So on those two relationships, I really want your point of view. And Christina, you're right, theory and practice. My last question is, internally, within Culture Trip, within Protagon, what are you doing as far as, is it part of your mission, your strategy, to say we are sustainable, and this is what, we're not going to travel too much. Our choices about traveling, our choice about how we consume, as a company, as employees, we're applying all of that.
Christina, you want to go first?
Thank you, Philip. Well, I'd say that we are more sensitive and we wish to highlight, I mean, there are efforts that support sustainability, that incorporate sustainability, and we try to support these efforts and highlight them and show that there is another way. So, for example, I was recently in Crete, in the eastern part of Crete, in Scythia, where recently, last year, Scythia was entered the UNESCO Geoparks. So the scenery is much different than the northern part of Crete, which is a mass tourism destination. And this is a different aspect and a different approach of how to develop tourism with an holistic approach. So we wish and we try to highlight and support this kind of efforts and show that there's a different way.
It's actually a huge topic. We have 30 seconds for you.
Okay, 30 seconds. We tend not to travel anywhere out of hundreds of pieces of content that we'll publish a month. Overwhelming majority is written by people who actually live in cities they write about. So we travel very, very rarely, and that is the reason why we exist, and that's our model.
Then thank you very much. If you have other questions, please feel free to come to us.
Thank you.